Thank you. I see Ryan's Hope got a little bit of a buzz over there. Yeah. Thanks for coming. I really do appreciate it. I always love an opportunity to talk about my heritage, to talk about this book. I want to thank Villanova. I want to thank Gina and Callie and the staff here, and Father Peter, who has been a great support of me and my book. And sorry he couldn't be here, he's traveling. So that was a little clip from Prisoners Among Us, which is a documentary that was released in 2004. It was the genesis for this project of the book. And she mentioned about Prisoners Among Us in the intro, but the Prisoners Among Us is about Italian-American immigration, assimilation, and the largely unknown events leading up to World War II. And there were, how do we get to full screen here? There we go, here. Sorry about this, I'm a writer, not a technician. Okay, and you can find that. Actually, you can find it for free on YouTube if you look for Prisoners Among Us / Michael. Michael DeLauro is the director of Prisoners Among Us. But that, combined with my background and my family, is really the genesis for the Project L'America. I used to sit at the feet of my grandparents and great aunts and uncles and listen to their stories. I didn't know it was preparing me for Prisoners Among Us. I didn't know it was preparing me for this book. But I learned a lot about the old country. I learned a lot about family, tradition, heritage, work ethic, the importance of our heritage, and how all of this, how many of you are Italian American? Great. You don't have to be Italian American to appreciate this story, because this is the story of all of our ancestors and what they had to endure in order to get here. But how this happened, I think, is vitally important. And I think it's important to combat stereotypical Italians. We don't just own pizza joints and off people, as Hollywood and television would like us to believe. We have returned volumes of culture and heritage to this country, and I think that's really important. I think it's a story that has to be told. I know I'm biased, but I think it's a story that has to be told because it's a story, as I said, of all Americans. We can't take for granted who we are. We can't take for granted where we came from. We need to really understand that. This picture is a picture of my family from around 1910, just outside of Pittsburgh. The gentleman in the back in the white sweater with his hand up in the air is my grandfather, Giuseppe Fusca. Happens to be this guy's grandfather as well, my cousin Pat. Obviously, music, cards, gatherings were really important. These are the folks I learned my heritage from. And history, I believe, and if I get on my soapbox just a little bit, is largely ignored in this country. And consequently, many Americans don't know where they came from, why those people came here, and actually what it took for them to get here, and how they shaped us to make a way in this country for all of us and how we are here now. I want to tell you a story. When I was doing that film, I was really happy about having that opportunity. And as you can see from the clip, some of it has to do with discrimination and all of those typical kinds of things. And we'll talk about some of the other stuff, like I said, the events leading up to World War II. But I was telling my aunt, actually Pat's mother, my mother's sister. My mother had passed away. And I was telling my aunt many years ago about this film. and how excited I was about doing this film. And she looked at me with a blank stare. She was just staring, and I thought, well, what's the problem here? And then finally she said, don't make a story about complainers. Italians aren't complainers. We do what we're supposed to do, and then we go back to business. And that stuck with me, because there was a road, and I could have taken two different paths in writing this film. I could have written a path about, oh, woe is us. Look what happened to us. People don't realize what happened to us poor Italians. Or I could have taken the other road, which ultimately I did, to make it a story of victory. That in spite of obstacles that not just Italians faced, but everyone faced, we have been able to make a way for ourselves. They have been able to make a way for their children, who made a way for us in the next generation, and we're in turn trying to make a way for our kids and grandchildren. So that's really important. This is not a film. This is not a book about the injustices. It talks about them, and it tells the truth about them, but it doesn't ask for reparations. So I went back after doing this film and revisited immigration and assimilation, because documentaries, being what they are, even though we were on many PBS stations and we did screenings around the country and things much like this to talk about the film, it didn't have a large audience. I wanted to make the stories that I learned more accessible. And so I went back and took a look in more depth about immigration and assimilation, and decided, after someone suggested I write the book, to write a novel of historical fiction. Well, America is a novel of historical fiction. It tells the story of three families who emigrate on the same steamship in 1915, the Santa Ana. It's Giuseppe Mosca and his son Franco. They come from Serra San Bruno in Calabria. Aldo Grimaldi, his wife Anna, and their son Salvatore come from Naples. And Paolo Lechemia, who is a 16-year-old stowaway who jumps on the ship in Palermo. Interestingly enough, we have a guy here today who was talking, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Tony Saraceno.
Tony. Tony showed me a document in July of 1915, and this story starts in 1915. In July of 1915, his family, his grandfather, was on the Santa Ana and boarded the ship in Palermo.
Whoa.
So that's an interesting segue into telling you that that's what this book is. This book has three fictional characters. They're composites. They're composites of people from the video, from the documentary, people in my family, people who I've researched. So those three people from Palermo, Calabria, Naples are composites. But the events, the history, right down to the events on the ship, are all absolute accurate history. That's really important to me. Now, I think it's important also to understand why these people came. Maybe just a little bit of a history lesson. I'm trying not to be too boring, all right? Back in the 1800s, in fact, 1815 to 1871, Italy was pretty fragmented, the peninsula of Italy. And a lot of city-states, a lot of different dialects and that kind of thing. And so there was a cry for consolidation, to consolidate the different states into one kingdom of Italy. Ultimately, it became a kingdom of Italy. This is the seal of the kingdom of Italy. And a kingdom of Sicily. It was very difficult to consolidate that remote island. And it finally was, unification, they called it, was finally completed in 1871. But it was not without its difficulties. As I said, there were different dialects and the remote villages and those kinds of things. And what happened was what they called the Piedmontization of the peninsula. This yellow up here is the northern part of Italy, down to central Italy. Down here, this tan area is called the Mezzogiorno. That stands for midday because of the midday sun and because it's warmer down in those areas. Well, the Piedmont area tried to unify the southern part of the peninsula and Sicily and give them the northern influence. And it wasn't working. And there were civil wars. And as a result, there was redistribution of land in the south. There's largely agriculture down here, and it was getting smaller and smaller land areas, and people were starving. They were literally starving in the south. Some were starving in the north, and some, suffered the consequences of unification in the north, but not like the south. And as a matter of fact, about 10% ultimately of the southern population of Italy eventually emigrated somewhere. Most to the United States, but emigrated somewhere. There's shots here of some folks in the agricultural folks in the southern part of Italy back in the turn of the century in the early 1900s. I want to point this out to you. I mentioned one of the characters is Giuseppe Mosca and the Mosca family from Serra San Bruno in Calabria. They were farmers, and he was also a tailor. What he couldn't make growing fruits and vegetables, he would make by mending pants and sewing suits and those kinds of things. But of course, those luxuries went by the wayside when once every 6 weeks you had a piece of meat this big in your family. And so this is how they lived largely in Calabria. This is why they were forced to move. This is a mud hut. They were built into the side of the mountains, in the mountains of Calabria. They were tufa, or it's a form of limestone. This is the main area, and down underneath this, which you can't see, the basement is a walkout basement, and that's where they kept the livestock. Their mules, the chickens, the donkeys, anything they could afford lived in the basement of their house. You can imagine that. This fireplace. They used the fireplace, obviously, in the wintertime to keep warm, but they ran it all year round. They ran it all year round because in the summertime, they needed the smoke to keep the mosquitoes out. So think about that. You're living in this mud hut, filled with smoke, raising a family, over livestock, eating a piece of meat every 6 weeks, and trying to get as many zucchini and red onions, etc., that you could to feed your family. Got to the breaking point, and they had to do something. In the case of Giuseppe Mosca in the book, his aunt sells a donkey for passage for him and his son to come to L'America, which is how the Italians pronounced it. Which is why that's the name of the book. To come to L'America to make a way, maybe earn some money, go back, feed the family, or in many cases, bring the family over. So in southern, in the southern regions, in Calabria, there's a lot of poverty, and it was an agricultural area. In Naples, where Aldo Grimaldi is from, and his wife, Aldo Grimaldi is a contractor and had a pretty good business. But the problem is, after unification, some of the underbelly of society rose to the top. In the case of Naples, it was the Camorra. The Camorra is a form of the Cosa Nostra, the mafia. And they took over the businesses in Naples, and they squeezed them. They squeezed them in order for them to get contracts for resurgence in Italy during the unification. You had to pay them off. You had to pay them off. Well, Aldo decided he wasn't going to pay these people off. And this is actually a picture of some of the members of the Camorra in Naples. So Aldo ultimately decides he's got to leave Italy. He's going to join his uncle, who lives in the Midwest, in Cleveland. There's a large Italian population in the Midwest, and a lot of them were either miners or they were stonecutters and masons. And being an original stonecutter, Aldo decides to go move to Cleveland and establish his family there and try and grow the family business. In the South, in Palermo, everybody knows about the Cosa Nostra, everybody knows about the mafia. It's a real thing, okay? I don't like the way it's characterized for every Italian man, woman, child in the United States these days, but it is a real thing. In Italy, it was a real thing. This picture is a picture of a bunch of guys with some lemons. That's important because Paolo Lachimia, the stowaway from Calabria, from Palermo, he wants to make it in the Cosa Nostra so bad. He's the son of a fisherman. His father dies, and he doesn't want to mend nets anymore. I gotta watch those dentures. And he wants to live the life of a bad guy, and so he lives his life on the streets. And one of his jobs is to guard the citrus. The Cosa Nostra forced growers to pay them so that you would guard the citrus so that no one would steal it. So that you would guard the cattle in the hills and the sheep so no one would steal them. Of course, that was nonsense, but if you did not pay for the protection, you had consequences. You'll find in the book that Paolo Lachimia loved those consequences. He wanted to be a part of it, but you'll find also that through a series of events, he got to flee too. So he gets on the boat in Palermo as a stowaway, and he decides that he's going to, through a series of events, mimic a steward to make his way to the United States. In 1880 to 1920, roughly 20 million people emigrated from different countries to the United States. 20 million from 1880 to 1924, okay? I don't want you to spend too much time on the left side or the right side of this chart, but in the center where you see the green peak, that's the late 1800s to the early 1920s, okay? And that green peak are Italians. There were roughly 4 million Italians who came to the United States, 4.5 million Irish, 5 million Germans, and several million Eastern Europeans and Slavs. And they all came by way of steamship, because that was the form of travel in those days, and they came to one of 4 different ports: Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and of course the most famous one, Ellis Island and New York City. And when people came to the United States and they came to Ellis Island is an island, that's obviously, it's an island off of an island. It was very confusing for these folks, and we'll talk about the travel, but it was very confusing for these folks because they would have to get off the ship, they would have to go through the way customs and immigration was, that then get back on a barge and be taken to the mainland if everything was okay. This is the Great Hall in Ellis Island. This is where people lined up, and you can't see it, but below the flag is a series of podiums where they had people in uniform who would be asking questions and making sure that everything was up and up so that you could be deemed ready for American society. Well, when the ship was boarded in 1915 in the ports of Palermo and Genoa and Naples, and then finally made its way to the United States, most people who came, including the 3 folks we're talking about in the book, those folks had to travel in what is called steerage. Steerage is the belly of the beast. Steerage is as close to the engine compartment as you can get without being in the engine compartment. Conditions were horrible. Travel was about 13 to 15 days. And it was brutal. This is steerage, a steerage compartment. Those Metal bins are actually bunks with straw mattresses. The table in front is a bunch of utensils and pots. Gruel, literally gruel, was dealt out to the people in steerage in big ladles, and that's how they ate. There was a lot of sickness, a lot of seasickness. If the weather was bad, you had to stay in steerage. You couldn't open the hatch. It was dark. It was smelly. People vomited a great deal, and they never cleaned it up. They were told to sweep it under these beds. And then when they got to a port, 13 days later, they would hose it down. It's suggested that maybe 50% of the women traveling alone were raped. Many were murdered. There was larceny. It was a horrible way to travel. It was a horrible way to endure that crossing, coming to some place of hope, called the United States. Up top of this picture are, this is the second class folks looking down on the steerage folks, on the folks who come up on the deck, and they often threw down sweetmeats and pennies to this luckless lot. But when the weather was decent, they would come out they would wrap themselves in the ship's blankets, they'd come out on the deck, they'd hug a steam pipe if they could find it for warmth, and they did their best to make their way from their port of departure to the port of entry in the United States. The three people in the book, Giuseppe, Aldo, and Paolo, all traveled for the most part in steerage and eventually make their way to the United States. There's a quote from a book called La Storia from Jerry Mangione and Ben Moriali. I used the book a lot as part of the research for the documentary, and some of the book. It says, for many, the steerage passage across the Atlantic was remembered as a kind of purgatory, a period of punishment imposed on them by Providence for having abandoned their motherland. The idea of abandonment was really, really prominent in these folks, in these people who left their homeland. As difficult as it was in Italy for these folks, they had to leave. They didn't want to leave, but they had to leave. And so the idea of abandonment is pretty prominent. I don't know if you can see this or not. This happened to be a review in Italian American Magazine of the book L'America. I'm not going to tell you about the wonderful review, but this one statement is really true. It says, as they wrestle with the question of whether Italy abandoned them or they abandoned Italy, one thing remains clear. Italy stays in the blood, and readers will agree. That theme is really important in the lives of Paolo and Aldo and Giuseppe, that Italy is going to remain in their blood. It courses through their veins throughout their assimilation process of in this time in their lives. So when they get to Ellis Island, people are shuttled through these chutes, and they're asked questions. And they're going through a series of events, some of which they didn't understand. There were 5, 6, 7, 8 different languages being spoken, people yelling at them, orders being yelled back and forth. But if they made their way through that, they would get to various stations where they would be asked questions. How much money did they have in their pocket? Who was traveling with them? Did they have someplace to go? Did they have a job? And did they have trachoma? Trachoma is a dreaded eye disease back in those days. And they had these guys called the button hook men. The button hook men in Ellis Island were gentlemen in uniform who had these button hooks, and they would turn the lids of the travelers inside out to look for trachoma. You had trachoma, back on the boat. As a matter of fact, if you were lame, oftentimes you were put back on the boat. And they built on Ellis Island a 4-story psychopathic pavilion. Because if they thought you had some form of dementia or a cognitive problem, you were going to have to spend some time in the psychopathic pavilion until they deemed you worthy to join American society. This is actually an interview. The guy in uniform is asking questions and asking for guys to do some small tasks here to see whether or not they are cognitively impaired. And if they were deemed cognitively impaired, they got themselves a bed in the psychopathic pavilion. Let's try doing that today. There's a quote from Order of Sons of Italy. I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them. And in fact, that's what happened to the people who came to New York. They were, they found whatever jobs they could possibly find. Now, if they were fortunate enough to have a padrone, anybody hear about what a padrone is? A padrone is someone you hired before you left Italy. They are Italian. They live in New York, if that was your port of entry. They live in New York. They find you a job. They find you a place to stay. For a fee, of course. They help you manage your money so you can send some back home. They find great accommodations for you. People like Giuseppe Dimaggio and his son, Franco, lived in a tenement like this, obviously with other people. They didn't have a room to themselves. And everything, all of their worldly possessions were piled up or hung on the walls. And if they were fortunate enough to get a job, which Giuseppe in the book gets a job, to be a rag and bone man. Anybody hear of a rag and bone man? Oh yeah, you read the book. Oh yeah. A rag and bone man is, you get a cart and a stick, like the guys on the side of the highways picking up trash. And you go out 4 o'clock in the morning before anybody else is up on the streets of New York City. You have a basket on your back. And you have this cart, and you go pick up anything you can find. Glass, metal, any papers, any objects at all, dead cats, dead dogs, and dead rats. And then you would take it to this woman next in the next picture. She's in a basement. There's a little ladder next to her. You would dump at the end of the day the contents down into the basement. She would sort through it to see what they could use, what they could recycle. And if you were fortunate, you got about a nickel for doing that, and you'd be back at it 4 o'clock the next morning. Everybody's thinking, dead dogs, cats, and rats, why? They used the bones to make knife handles. So Giuseppe, you'll see Giuseppe, you read the book, you'll see Giuseppe and Franco spend a period of time as rag and bone men. Aldo and his family, as I said, go to Cleveland to join their family to get work. Well, Cleveland was a center in the Midwest, as I said, a center for masons, and Italians have built some of the most incredible structures in this country. Most of Washington, D.C., most of those monuments were built by Italians. Well, Aldo and his family go, and they become and he becomes a stone cutter. Here they're cutting stones back in about 1920. They're cutting these Rosettas in Cleveland. There was an area, they had Big Italy and Little Italy, and you'll read about that, but they had an area called Hiram House, which was a settlement of Italians. Then on the West Coast, when Aldo not only ticks off the Cosa Nostra, not Aldo, when Paolo, thank you, when Paolo ticks off the Cosa Nostra in Sicily and has to come to the United States, then he ticks off the Black Hand in New York, and he's got to go join his uncle on the West Coast and reacquaint himself with his sardine fishing skills. Italians were the best sardine fishermen in the 20s and 30s on the West Coast. They settled in Cannery Row, Monterey. This is a picture of what's called a, these are lamprey nets on a lamprey boat. And I've learned more about sardine fishing in the 20s than any man should know if you don't fish for sardines. But as I said, history is really important to me, so the accuracy is really important. So you'll read about about that. But here's something interesting. Can anybody see the guy on the right? Bending over. Does he look familiar to anyone? Maybe you can't see.
I'm close up.
You're close. Go ahead, tell him who it is.
Joe Dimaggio.
That's Joe Dimaggio. On the West Coast, Paolo and his uncle joined Giuseppe Dimaggio and his family in the fishing business. Giuseppe Dimaggio was Joe and Vince and Dom Dimaggio's father. They emigrated from Palermo a little earlier than Paolo came over. Paolo took they called him Little Paolo, Giuseppe Paolo. Giuseppe Paolo Dimaggio was Little Paolo on the docks. He never wanted to help his father because he hated the smell of fish. So he would sneak off and play sandlot baseball. So you'll learn more about the Dimaggio family and the fishing business if you read the book, and Paolo's special relationship with Joe Dimaggio. But here's one of those moments when Joe was forced to do some mending on what's called a lighter, which is a boat that's towed to carry the nets. Well, emigration, as I said, between 1890 and 1924 was huge. 20 million people. That's a lot of people. For a country such as ours in the late 1800s and early 1900s, these people came in legally, came through the process, and tried to find work and that kind of thing. Well, the United States decided in 1924, time out. We can't do this. We can't have these people coming to this country in these volumes. And so what they did was in May of 1924, a bill was signed into effect, 3 bills actually, the Johnson-Reed Act, the Asian Exclusion Act, and the National Origins Act. And that was an immigration bill that did the following. Number one, at first it halted the immigration of all Asians, stopped them in 1924, no Asians allowed. Then it issued quotas on other nationalities. And that quota was based on an 1890 census. So in the United States, they would take a census of, let's say, Italians. How many Italians did they estimate were living in the United States as of 1890? 2% of that number could then legally enter the country per year. And the same thing with Germans and Irish and Slavs, et cetera, et cetera. And then a little later, they added a provision in the bill that if you were 16 or older, you had to be literate. Okay? Think about that. Think about that. People say we've always had open borders. People say, immigration, and you have your own political view about immigration. This is the truth about immigration. When you read L'America and when you read about the stories of these 3 families, you'll see what true immigration in its heyday in the United States really was, and what the difficulties were for these folks. That law, by the way, wasn't revised until 1954. There were a lot of problems with Italians and other folks who came to the United States with their political views. Some were socialists, some were anarchists, and some were actually fascists. Book 1 culminates in 1927, actually in August of 1927. In August of 1927 is when 2 guys, and they were anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, were executed for the murder of a paymaster in Braintree, Massachusetts. They supposedly robbed him and murdered him. Sacco and Vanzetti became poster children for the Italian experience, and how capitalism was, was putting its foot on the necks of immigrants, and some of that, yes, is true. But whether or not Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty still remains a mystery. Some think it was a miscarriage of justice. Some think that they were in fact guilty. But the book 1 ends in 1927 with their execution, because I believe that to be one of the seminal moments in Italian-American history. They gathered around these folks, whether they believed in socialism or anarchism or not. They gathered around these folks and wanted to see them freed, and they championed their cause because it was they were oppressed Italian Americans. So that's book one. It ends in 1927. If you're intrigued enough after reading book one, I'm working on book two. Book two begins in the Great Depression in 1929, and it has a lot to do with this guy, Benito Mussolini, the author of Fascism. Has a lot to do with FDR and the New Deal, and his sweeping economic reforms of Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Recovery Administration, and those kinds of things. But the United States, I don't know how many of you know this, but the United States back in the 30s was enamored by Benito Mussolini. They loved him. This is a Saturday Evening Post. They did a serialization week after week of his autobiography. And FDR had an advisor in his brain trust, a guy by the name of Rexford Tugwell. FDR sent Rexford Tugwell to Italy to spend some time with Mussolini to learn what aspects of fascism would be appropriate for our country. I mean, if you think about it, he was desperate to find something. I mean, there were difficult times. There was a Wall Street poem that was praising Benito Mussolini. But the tide turned when Mussolini joined forces with the Axis in 1939. He partnered with Hitler. And that became another seminal moment for our characters in the book and for the Italian population at large. Now they had a problem. This guy Mussolini, is dancing with the devil. They loved Mussolini. He made the trains run on time. He started the highway system. He did a lot of good things. He had these screen actor good looks and charisma, and they thought he was going to be the second coming for their Italy, so that they could go back and prosper. But then he makes this turn, and they've got conflicted. And in that conflict, it created problems for them. If you had a picture in your dining room of Mussolini, you were suspect. The government started getting paranoid. And you will find, when you read book two, when I finish book two, you will find that there were things that happened. The United States decided, they issued a proclamation, I think it was 2527, proclamation in 1941 that labeled 600,000 Italians who were not citizens, enemy aliens. Men, women, and children were enemy aliens. And what that meant was they were issued ID cards, given travel restrictions, curfews, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. And if they suspected that you were a fascist, and they had this fifth column mentality. They thought that there was a fifth column internally. Now, what that means is, you have four columns that support a building. They had a fifth. They thought that the Italians who were here, the Germans who were here, were a fifth column forming from inside to uproot the efforts of the United States and win the war on behalf of the Axis. And so they labeled these guys enemy aliens. They arrested some of them. They would break into their homes, and they would arrested some of them, and because they were suspected of being fascist. They would, at the very least, take their radios, their cameras, their flashlights, and binoculars, because, God forbid, some old Italian woman should be signaling the submarines that are approaching the mainland. In worst cases, what they did was they interned them. There were Italians who were interned in 4 different camps around the country. And you'll see this in the book. They had camps in Montana, Oklahoma, Texas, and Tennessee. Little huts, They gave him 3 squares, gave him work to do and that kind of thing, but some of them were interned as long as 2.5 years. The opera star Ezio Pizza, actually, who did war bond drives, and he sacrificed on behalf of the Allies. He was interned. He was interned on Ellis Island. Think of the irony of that. They had people for a couple of years living on Ellis Island as prisoners because they were suggested to be enemy aliens. On the West Coast, they were worried about those submarines, and so in the urban areas, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, they drew arbitrary lines of demarcation. If you were an Italian and not a citizen, you could not travel west of that line. So if you lived west of that line, if you worked west of that line, it's too bad. You're gone. They moved them east of that arbitrary line. Fend for yourself. They helped them move, but they didn't help them find a place to stay. They'd have to board up their homes and find someplace with someone else, and you'll see that in book 2. Because they were worried about signaling the U-boats. They realized in relatively short order that that was kind of stupid. And so FDR, in political fashion, on 1941, in October of 1941, on Columbus Day, he announced that everybody could come home. And the way he announced that is he put an announcement in the post offices in English. A lot of these people didn't speak English. A lot of these people never stepped foot in the post office. So months and months and months passed before some of these people, or a lot of these people, knew that they could come back home. And they were guarded. They, in camps like this. So book 2 will take you from 1929 and continue the lives of these 3 folks in their lives in New York, Cleveland, and the West Coast. They will encounter labeling enemy aliens. They will encounter relocation. They will encounter internment. But as I said, this is a story of victory, okay? And you'll see that if I ever finish the book. Book 2, I hope to release in 2020. Book 1 is called L'America Adagio con Fear. Book 2 is called L'America Adagio con Promise. What do I have showing here? Anybody recognize that park? Probably not. This is Fenway Park in 1946. Okay? There is a reason why Fenway Park in 1946 plays prominently in Book 2. In fact, Book 2 culminates inside the confines of Fenway Park. You'll just have to read the book to find out why. As was mentioned earlier, the bookstore, I think, has some soft covers that they're selling. If we run out of soft covers, I have more. I also have hard covers for sale. I take cards, cash. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Many Italian Americans fought in the World War II.
Yes.
So I'm curious, how did the government make the distinction between those who would get interned and those who seemed to,
Okay.
were they more assimilated in some way? Or?
No, not necessarily, but it's a very good question. Yes, as a matter of fact, Italians experienced the largest number of casualties in World War II, Italian Americans. 10% of the casualties in World War II were Italian American descent. That's a really good question because it's not as cut and dried as you would think. There were Italians who became citizens, and it was easy. Okay, you're going to go to war. And many times you're going to fight on the soil of your ancestors, which they did. I think you may have seen Tom Brokaw in our documentary mention that. And so that was the easy part. You're not going to get interned, you're not going to get relocated if you've become a citizen, and we're going to draft you. If you weren't a citizen, though, it's possible that they still drafted you, which seems kind of weird, but it's true. They needed people, and some of the branches. There's a funny story in the documentary. Some of the branches didn't care where you came from. We just need you, and so there were many non-citizen Italians, first generation. Who fought in the war, and unfortunately fought on the soil of their ancestors. The interesting thing about that, to take it a step further, is that was the first time when the United States ever had prisoner of war camps on our soil. We had a number of prisoner of war camps. In fact, there's one that will come into play in the book too, that's north of Cleveland, Camp Perry, and these were mostly Italians from the Axis powers who were captured in North Africa, and they were shipped to these different prisoners of war camps. Well, our camps were not like Japanese camps. They had dinners, they had dances, they formed what's called Italian service units. They let them come outside of the gates and work in the communities. And many people, in fact, you'll see, if you ever see the documentary, there's a couple who met at a dance. From Camp Perry. The woman would go up for the weekends to dance and to have pasta, and she met her husband there. Yes, sir.
Just piggybacking on that, because that was the same question I had, is my dad was first generation Italian American. He was shipped over to Italy and was in Italy theater during the war.
Hey.
But the Japanese Americans were not allowed to fight in the Pacific, but they did ship them over to Europe. But
Right. It didn't make sense. No, and I can't tell you the reason for that. I can only tell you about the unfortunate stories of Italians who had to fight their cousins. Yes.
My father fought in the Pacific Theater
As did mine.
for the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, and then my uncle was in France for D-Day. So I'm not sure, he enlisted.
Yes.
And maybe I remember him saying at one point that he preferred to choose
The
where
branch,
he was going to go
or where he was going to go. Yeah.
than to be sent.
Yeah. That's
Maybe that has.
maybe my father enlisted as well. And my father, when he came out of high school, it was a Marine in the South Pacific during World War II. Yes.
My cousin lost his life in Pearl Harbor, 18 years old.
In the war. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Someone else? Yes.
Different subject. Very nice about not making a story about the complainers and all, but do you get into the happy stories of in the 10s and the 20s of people that made enough money and went back? We
Yes.
have a lot of back and forth. in
We
my
do.
family.
We do. It happens that, and yes, that is mentioned, but it happens that these three folks, since I wanted to primarily focus on Italian-American assimilation, these three folks stay in this country and enjoy the fruits of their labors and some prosperity and subsequent generations, because that's who I am. My grandfather came in 1898. And my parents were born here, but all my grandparents on both sides of the family were born in Italy. So I wanted to write something similar to our story. Anyone else? Hey, listen, I really appreciate this. I love talking about this. I hope I didn't keep you too long. But I'll be glad to answer any other questions one-on-one, sign some books. Thank you.